Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great research being done by folks using the historical collections at the Hagley Library, especially scholars who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Evan Brown is a PhD candidate at Columbia University. Evan, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you're researching and writing about?
Well, my research is interested in basically the broad social and economic transformations that play out in North American professional baseball over the sort of middle of the 20th century. So from after the Second World War into sort of the 1960s. And the reason I find this interesting is because these sort of changes that happen through baseball both set the pattern for the sort of broader kind of sports industry that we come to know today, and also I think reflect a lot of the other sort of questions and historical debates that are playing out in this post-war period more generally, particularly as relates to sort of the relationship of labor and business and sort of the new kind of entertainment and cultural geography of the United States.
What attracted you to the subject?
Well, I mean, I always grew up playing sports, following sports, right? And that can take you a long way in terms of sort of figuring out the world and your place in it, and meeting lots of different people. And it was definitely the way that I sort of came to understand sort of society more generally. And I think, like a lot of people, I got interested in the history of baseball through this sort of, possibly its most famous historical narrative, which is of its role in racial desegregation, connections to the civil rights movement, things like that. And as I started looking into this as a question of research, it took me in slightly unexpected directions, because it really became clear that baseball was a very international phenomena in this period, and that the following the movements of players got very quickly outside the sort of mental frame that I think most people consider baseball today. So to put it in other words, right, one of the things that for people who are fans of baseball or other sports might be familiar with is this appeal of sort of timelessness, right? This narrative that, especially with teams that have been around for hundreds of years, there's the sense that the game is always the same and it's always been like this. And that familiarity is very nice because it can get you access into historical events that you feel like you have a chance of understanding, and then you realize very quickly that things were a lot different and were changing all the time, and could have gone in other directions. And so what that brought me to, in addition to the international geography, was a really renewed focus on the sort of the labor question in baseball and in sports more broadly, and the world of kind of business practices. First, as how these business practices intersected with the processes of racial desegregation. Secondly, how they sort of shaped the international geography of baseball that we see today, right? Where unlike, for example, soccer in Europe, where you would have sort of a variety of strong national leagues, some of which with more money and resources than others, but a sort of truly international competition, you have more of a pyramid structure with particular leagues in the United States at the top. And the third piece being really, again, tracking how people and information are moving throughout this world in a way that requires both expansive and innovative management practices, but is also fueled by these sort of efforts of players, their families, and other sort of workers in athletic industries to try to sort of carve out a living for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think most listeners will be familiar with the attraction of Caribbean players, baseball players, to the United States market. Could you perhaps elaborate on this geography of baseball in your period?
Of course. So yeah, something that we see today, right, is certainly the major influence of players and fans, especially from the Dominican Republic, from Puerto Rico, and increasingly from Japan and Korea. You know, also through television, right? We can enjoy this, you know, in the recent World Baseball Classic, or you know, up here in New York where I live, you just go down to the park and you really see baseball as the international game that it is, right? The interesting thing about the sort of 1940s, 1950s is that the relationship between the national leagues in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, in Mexico, and other places as well, Panama, Venezuela, the relationship between those leagues and what we now know today as Major League Baseball is not strictly set or strictly hierarchical yet. And this is because at the time, baseball for the great majority of players is not actually full-time year-round employment, in the sense of just because you play for a team in what we now call Major League Baseball doesn't mean they pay you year-round, and doesn't mean that is enough to make a living year-round. And in these Caribbean leagues, for the most part, they play in the winter. So this creates a sort of seasonal pattern of employment where players, whether they're from the United States or from the Caribbean, will play for one team in the summer and then maybe go elsewhere in the winter to make a few more dollars, to work on their game, right? And also for some of them, it really is also an adventure, right? They bring their families, they have maybe better weather than where they're from, right? And for obviously players from these areas, it's, you know, a chance to play sort of at home, or at least in a environment maybe where there's a more familiar language or culture. And so this is a really integral part of the you know, seasonal rhythms of baseball in this time period. Now, over the course of the 1940s and 50s, this becomes increasingly systematic and regulated by the Major League Baseball, which in this period is not called Major League Baseball. That's another question. But the what we know as the American and National Leagues, the teams that most listeners would be familiar with, basically sign contracts that grant them a degree of control over the operations of these winter leagues in exchange for access to players, essentially. And this push for control is a result of big conflicts, particularly in the 1940s, in which players were using these leagues, and also particularly a league in Mexico that played in the summer, as competition and leverage in salary negotiation, right? As another option that was creating a situation where teams would have to essentially pay them more because they were competing for their services.
And does this contract process begin to build that pyramidal hierarchy that you were describing earlier?
Yes, because it starts to place a sort of set of procedures through which the primary employer of players who would, you know, move throughout this circuit becomes the team based in the United States. And there are basically limits on how many players will go. There are procedures in place where requests can be approved or denied. And this is both taking the question a little out of the hands of the Caribbean teams, who are now sort of working through the leagues to request players rather than approaching the players directly.
Mm.
But it also takes it a little more out of the hands of the players, who now can't say, oh, well, last year I was in Panama and I liked it there, and so I'd prefer to go back there, right? They might get assigned somewhere else. And this also, the thing that makes it radically different today is also that now the players are really considered to be year-round. Their sort of obligation to their primary team is such that the teams are very reluctant to grant permission because of the risk of injury and things like that, and also because the players have earned enough money that they're not seeking out this kind of employment as much. Although we still see this, for example, in the WNBA and women's basketball, right? This practice of, in what's the off season in the United States, arranging as a player or a group of players a second contract somewhere else that plays a different league season in order to create a sort of year-round living in professional sports.
That's very interesting. What other changes occurred during this mid-20th century period that you're looking at?
Well, there's a lot more. You can go way into the details if you're interested in sort of labor and management. There's a lot more changes that really happen sort of at the nitty-gritty level there. But I think what people maybe would be more familiar with generally would be the expansion and relocation of major league teams from the Northeast and Midwest into the West Coast, the Sunbelt. So for people who may not be familiar, before the 1950s, all of the top professional baseball teams are located essentially east of St. Louis and north of Washington, D.C., right? And there are, 3 teams in New York, 2 teams in Boston, 2 teams in Philadelphia. It's really concentrated in a way that reflects the sort of industrial geography of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so as there's a major population shift towards California, towards the Sun Belt, there's increasing interest in having the geography of top level professional baseball shift to match. And that's a really dramatic process, not only sort of, in cultural terms, because of what it involves with people's attachment with fans, but insofar as it involves urban projects of urban development, right? Resources for stadiums that are reshaping landscapes, and also really a change in what it means to actually attend a baseball game based on where the stadium is located and the neighborhood that it's in and its relationship to the city. The other really major change in this time period, the one that is fundamental to how I think people engage in sports today, is the rise of television broadcasting. Right? And this is something that transforms the business model from where the primary source of revenue is someone has to buy a ticket and show up at the ballpark, to one in which there are basically set agreements that bring in established amount of revenue for a certain amount of games placed on different television networks, where advertising really takes off beyond sort of billboards at the ballpark, and where you get the situation like today, where you have ESPN and cable networks and teams operating their own television networks, and Major League Baseball having its own streaming service, right? Something that really flips the economics of the sport in a new direction.
When do baseball players unionize?
So that happens in 1966 officially. But one of the most interesting things to me about this period of the 40s and 50s is the intensity of labor agitation sort of right below the surface, right? So the story of baseball's unionization in the 1960s, the first strikes as you go late 60s, early 70s, and the battles for free agency in the 70s, right, are really transformative to the sport's labor relations. And there's really this, I think, very useful and interesting scholarship and popular literature on the sort of period of early days of a formal union. But stretching all the way back actually to 1946, you know, the 1966 establishment of a union with a contract and the sort of increasing militancy there in the formal setting was not the first attempt to unionize players, and it was not the only way that players, tried to exert a degree of control over their workplace. So in 1946, two things happened that set off a sort of crisis situation around labor in baseball. One is that a series of players do get involved in a sort of formal unionization effort where there's a lawyer going around to different teams trying to get votes before the National Labor Relations Board, right? This is 1946, where there's a post-war strike wave, across the United States, right? And a time of advances for labor more generally, before the passage of Taft-Hartley in 1947. And so this formal unionization effort comes quite close in some respect, but does not break through sort of across the industry. But the other thing that happens is in 1946, about 25 players from the at that time still entirely white major leagues, they leave their teams and go to play in Mexico, because in Mexico there is a president of the league named Jorge Pascal, who basically has, since the 1930s, really the late 30s, early 40s, realized that he can really bring up the quality of the Mexican league by signing Black players from the United States and from Cuba who are racially excluded from playing in the most lucrative leagues in the United States. And so he brings them over, and this is a really important development both in the racial desegregation of baseball, but also he gives them a better deal, right, than they're getting elsewhere. And he decides to also now expand this project to these white players on these major league teams, right? The biggest famous names. And he succeeds in drawing groups of players who are dissatisfied to Mexico. Now, this is a real sort of, all hands on deck moment for management, as far as the structure of baseball labor really relies on something called the reserve clause, or the reserve system, which is essentially enforced both on the players and between teams that are parties to this agreement. And what this means is that once a player is signed as an 18, 19-year-old, right, the team that has signed them has the contractual rights to that player essentially forever, right? Because of the contractual obligation that it creates to the player, but also because all of the other teams that are sort of within this system have agreed not to recruit players from other teams. Mexico, Jorge Pascal, stepping outside this system, recruits these players away. And this means that the sort of open competition for wages, right, is a really dramatic, both for the players who go, a brief but rapid increase in their wages, but also a real threat to the kind of established patterns of labor recruitment and salary negotiation.
Mm.
And so what happens as a result of this, the players who go get suspended for 5 years, which affects them quite severely. However, in 1947, the owners agree to a minimum salary for the first time. They agree to to meet with player representatives, and they also they offer the players weren't given meal money or expenses money for spring training at this time.
Mm.
And so they're given money for this for the first time. And it's called Murphy money, which is the name of the lawyer who had tried to unionize players. But the Mexican situation, although they don't get Pascal money, right, is also a really key influence, both in the players actually gaining something in terms of labor conditions, but also in, as we discussed before, this change of the relationship between the leagues, right? Because this can't sort of be allowed to happen again. There's two other consequences of this that are, I think, important to mention. One is that the players who are suspended turn this into a legal question, right? And there are court cases that go first almost to the Supreme Court and then all the way to the Supreme Court that 20 years before the famous Curt Flood free agency case actually come very close to sort of legally overturning the labor regime in baseball. At the same time, Congress does an extensive investigation of baseball on monopoly grounds. And this is not only related to the labor relations of the players, but also to what's been mentioned before as far as the expansion of baseball into different territories. Because, for example, congressional representatives from California are very eager to question baseball about, what relationship it will have to Los Angeles, to San Francisco, because it's good political points to say, we want a better baseball team, right? And also because of the role of television, right? So the Department of Justice is actually investigating sort of the radio and television arrangements that baseball teams are coming up with. And so this legal question, really political question, carries out from the players' initial conflict through the 1950s. And one important marker for sort of that comes out of that is in 1961, Congress passes a bill granting sports leagues an antitrust exemption as far as it concerns negotiating television contracts on a national basis, which gives them the leverage that basically each time the contracts are renegotiated, they're able to pull in more and more and more revenue because they're not negotiating against each other, or they're able to coordinate more effectively. Now, one thing I will say about the players is they're not letting this all go by without keeping an eye on it themselves. And in that 1947 sort of settlement of that conflict with the Mexican League, the players also get their foot in the door for a pension plan, which is something they're really interested in. More even perhaps than having a union is having a pension, right? And this is, again, right, pensions are something that, through unions, workers, across the country are winning at this time. And the players are sort of reflecting this, saying, well, a pension, makes sense. And it's especially important for professional athletes because of the relatively short career that we're talking about here. And of course, also the risk of injury, things of that nature. And because, again, these players, if they're being signed to play professional baseball at the age of 18, 19, they're not necessarily getting higher education or other sorts of job training. So they're really invested in the pension. And one thing that they managed to get from the owners is a commitment that pension funding will be linked to broadcasting revenue from the All-Star Game and the World Series. Now, in 1947, broadcast revenue from the All-Star game and the World Series is okay. Radio, there's a bit of money there, but it's not a huge financial commitment. But from 1947 onwards, as television revenue skyrockets, this becomes a huge point of tension because the players say, well, we've established this claim to our share of broadcasting revenue, and if it's going up, it's going up. That's for the pension.
Yeah.
And as far as ownership, this is this sort of little what they said, oh, we'll give the players their little share of revenue, has now become this big fundamental part of the business, right? So that seed that's planted in 1947 is a real major point of mobilization for players throughout the 50s that contributes to the level of organization they're able to attain in the 60s and in the formal process of unionization and later collective bargaining.
I'm wondering, what sources in the Hagley collections did you dig into to help you uncover some of the story?
Well, so Hagley has a really useful and not unique, but hard to come by type of source, which is that it has the papers of the Philadelphia Phillies, which is one of the teams in the Major League Baseball, right? From about 1943, 1944 into the 1970s. And this is because Bob Carpenter, who owns the team at the time, these are his papers, right? And they're not comprehensive in the sense of sort of day in, day out, throughout these years, right? But what they do have, because of this vantage point of the sort of kind of board of directors of one team, is little interactions with almost every part of this kind of big picture that I've been describing at perhaps too much length, right? Which is that, if Philadelphia is negotiating a television contract, right, there's correspondence about that or correspondence with other teams arguing about whose radio station is allowed to cover a certain game, right? If there is a not every salary negotiation with players, right, but sometimes, right, a player with they take special attention negotiating someone's contract, and that appears, right? As the team attends the league meetings, the issues that are being debated in the league meetings filter back into the team's papers. There's also, there are financial documents where you can essentially follow, right, where broadcast revenue is going, where other sorts of investments in terms of where the team's resources are being allocated are going. And to that point, one of the largest both allocation of resources in terms of the team, and also aspect of this collection at Hagley that can make use of, is what at least in the Philadelphia organization they're calling team replacement, which might be more broadly considered scouting, labor recruitment, right? Which is the process of, okay, how do you go out in the world and come back with competent baseball players, right? Especially talking about this big geography now that's happening. And how you do that is essentially you have a scouting department where it's people's jobs to have certain geographic expertise, or have certain maybe connections at high schools or universities or other sorts of networks. And you have to basically coordinate this apparatus, use it to generate information, and base decisions off of that. And this aspect is really interesting because it's expensive. It's also how you get a sort of competent baseball team. And again, talking about the way that the labor structure works, right? When a player is, 18, 19, 20, this is their only time that they're on the open market, right? If another team signs this player, that's pretty much it, unless the player is traded or released later on. So there's this one very sort of high leverage moment in which the team is able to exercise a sort of control and labor recruitment, right? Of trying to get what it wants from a labor perspective. Now, this is also the one moment where the players have a bit of negotiating power, right? Because if you're a very, if you're a star high school baseball player, and the teams are coming to you, there is this moment where you, as the baseball player, and also oftentimes, at least in the sources, you see, mom and dad, right, weighing in, and having to sign the contract for them in some cases because they're very young, where there is negotiating, and this creates an environment of players being given bonuses, right? This is before this sort of amateur draft, which is instituted in 1965. So scouts are being invested in to try to find these players. And then when these players are identified, they're being given bonuses that are much larger than the sort of otherwise typical pay structure. So this creates a big incentive to sort of get these decisions right. And this is where the Philadelphia Phillies collection at Hagley has some really interesting material because of the efforts that the team is making to get this right are going in all sorts of directions, right? Firstly, there's the effort of, you have sort of traditional baseball scouts who, this is sort of where the famous, book and movie Moneyball, right? You have traditional baseball scouts who are going and seeing people visually or talking to their friends and making recommendations on that basis. And in the office, they're trying to systematize this, right? Because how do you compare people's assessments from, California, from North Dakota, from Florida, right? So they're trying to get them to fill out all this paperwork and adopt the sort of, kind of modern business practice. We have to have all of this on file. We have to use a numerical system instead of a letter system, right? There's this kind of attempted organization in that sense. But there's also other attempts to really kind of leapfrog the competition. So in the early 1950s, for example, there's a partnership with the University of Delaware that basically researchers at the University of Delaware start conducting kind of annual programs into high performance in athletics, right? And reporting these results to the Phillies, saying, well, we're trying all sorts of experiments, right? And this stuff is both sort of wonky in that kind of 1950s atomic age sort of way, right? That when you look back on old technology that didn't pan out. But in other ways, it actually really reflects things that now are very cutting edge in terms of what's possible with sports, right? So they are strapping electrical sensors to bats, right, to try to measure things that today are very important, like bat speed and launch angle and all these things that you see on a baseball broadcast, right? In 1951, 1952, they're having problems like, well, the sensor falls off the bat and we can't really get good data. So it's not a huge success, but they're really thinking in this direction. Again, an investment justified because of the kind of stakes of investing in these players. They're also doing things that are really trying to quantify and scrutinize the labor that players are doing as baseball players, right? So they are, collecting the whole catalog of baseball statistics that fans of sports will be familiar with. But they're also trying to, measure their eyeballs, right, with devices that are supposed to provide more information about sort of biomechanical information, right? About how they can, who can hit a baseball, not based on who's actually hitting the baseballs, but on sort of the speed of their eye movements, right? Things like that. And so this is really, I don't think it produces any specific breakthroughs on the baseball field, but it's a really fascinating, useful historical case of how the labor market dynamics of the sport intersect with kind of what is possible from a sort of scientific and managerial perspective, and you know, also I think speak to a sort of misperception that people sometimes have about baseball, which is that it's very that it, again, things have always been traditional, things have always been sort of in the classic, conservative sense. It's not to say that baseball is not full of people who are trying to do things the way it's always been done, but that there's all these attempts at what a modern reader or viewer might be surprised by.
Mm-hmm. Well, what a rich set of sources and what an interesting project. Evan, thank you for taking the time to share with me today.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to do the research at Hagley, and then of course to talk about it is even better.
Well, you're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.